There are moments in war when the laws of physics seem to bend, when human capability exceeds what training manuals declare possible, and when a single bullet travels farther than reason allows. In the winter of 1945, somewhere along the fractured line between the Ardennes and the Rhine, a shot was fired that German soldiers would speak of in whispers for decades afterward. The target, a Wehrmacht officer moving at full sprint across frozen ground. The distance, 1,200 yards. The result, a kill so precise, so mathematically improbable, that it silenced an entire defensive position and entered the mythology of marksmanship as both legend and impossibility. The shooter's name was never widely recorded in official dispatches. He was identified in fragmented after-action reports only as Corporal J, a sniper attached to a reconnaissance unit operating in the final, desperate months of the European theatre. What is known comes from declassified interview transcripts, unit journals kept by company clerks, and the testimony of German prisoners who witnessed the event and could not reconcile what their eyes had seen with what their military training told them was feasible. The shot occurred during a stalemate engagement near a contested river crossing, a place where American and German forces had traded artillery fire for 6 days without decisive movement. Visibility was poor. Snow fell in intermittent curtains. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and the wind cut across open terrain in unpredictable gusts that made long-range accuracy a gamble even for the most experienced marksman. Standard doctrine held that effective sniper engagement at such distances required stationary targets, ideal weather, and multiple attempts to gauge windage and elevation. None of those conditions existed that morning. German forces had positioned themselves along a ridgeline approximately 1,200 yards from the American forward observation post. They moved with confidence, believing the distance and weather rendered them safe from small arms fire. Officers moved openly, coordinating defensive positions and directing mortar teams. It was during one of these movements that Corporal J took his position behind a modified Springfield M1903A4, a rifle known for its accuracy but not for miracles. He had no spotter. He had no rangefinder beyond his own practiced eye. He had only the cold, the wind, and a moving target that protocol said was beyond the threshold of reliable engagement. The German officer, later identified through prisoner interrogation as Oberleutnant Franz Keller, a veteran of the Eastern Front and an officer respected for his tactical discipline, was crossing from one trench line to another when the bullet struck. He fell instantly. The men around him froze, confusion spreading faster than the sound of the shot itself. They scanned the distant tree line, searching for the origin of fire, but saw nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement. Just the reality of their officer lying motionless in the snow, killed by a weapon they believed could not reach them. American soldiers in the observation post witnessed the fall through field glasses. They too were stunned. One sergeant later wrote in his diary, "We didn't think it was real at first. Thought maybe Keller tripped or took shrapnel from a stray shell. Then Jay cycled the bolt and said, 'He's down.' No celebration, no shouting, just silence, like we'd all seen something we weren't supposed to." The shot changed the tenor of the engagement. German soldiers ceased moving in the open. Officers withdrew to covered positions. The confidence that distance provided safety evaporated. For the remainder of that day and into the next, the German line remained static, paralyzed not by overwhelming force, but by the psychological weight of a single, impossible kill. But the story did not end with the shot. In the years that followed, the event became a case study in the limits of marksmanship, a subject of debate among ballistics experts, military historians, and marksmen who sought to replicate the conditions and understand how such a shot could succeed. The variables were staggering. Bullet drop at 1,200 yards exceeded 30 feet, when deflection at that range could push a projectile several feet off target. The moving speed of the officer, estimated at a full run, roughly 6 to 8 miles per hour, meant the lead time required was beyond what standard training covered, and yet the shot landed. Decades later, when German veterans were interviewed for oral history projects, several who had been present that day spoke of the event with a mixture of respect and unease. One former Wehrmacht soldier, whose name was redacted in the archive, said, "We knew the Americans had good rifles. We knew they had trained shooters. But that shot, it made us wonder if they had something else, something we didn't understand." The bullet that killed Oberleutnant Keller was never recovered. The frozen ground and subsequent Allied advance meant the site was abandoned within days. What remains is the record, a shot fired under conditions that defied doctrine, that succeeded against probability, and that haunted both sides long after the war ended. The war demanded efficiency, the rifle delivered precision, but some shots carry more than lead. They carry the weight of what should not have been possible. Corporal J was not a name that appeared in commendations or medal citations. He was not photographed shaking hands with generals or featured in wartime propaganda reels. His service record, retrieved from National Archives holdings decades after the war, listed him as a rifleman assigned to forward reconnaissance, a designation so common it rendered him nearly invisible within the vast machinery of the American war effort. But those who served alongside him remembered a man whose relationship with distance and trajectory bordered on the instinctive, a shooter who read wind and terrain the way others read maps. He had enlisted in 1943, processed through basic training at Camp Shelby, and demonstrated exceptional marksmanship scores that flagged him for sniper instruction. The training was rigorous but abbreviated. War's urgency left little room for prolonged specialization. He learned to estimate range without instruments, to compensate for wind by watching vegetation and dust, to control his breathing and heartbeat during the moment of trigger pull. But what set him apart, according to his instructor's notes, was not technical excellence, it was patience. He could wait hours without movement, could hold position in discomfort that broke lesser men, and could fire only when certainty, not opportunity, presented itself. By the time he reached Europe in late 1944, Corporal J had already logged dozens of confirmed kills at ranges between 400 and 800 yards, distances considered effective for the Springfield platform he carried. His rifle was a standard-issue M1903A4, fitted with a Weaver 330C scope, a configuration trusted but not exceptional. He made no modifications beyond minor adjustments to the trigger pull weight and the addition of a leather cheek rest he had fashioned himself from salvaged material. The weapon was not remarkable. The man was. Those who shared foxholes and observation posts with him described a soldier who spoke infrequently, who seemed more comfortable in silence than conversation, and who approached each engagement with a methodical detachment that some mistook for coldness. One private, whose letters home were later archived, wrote, "Jay doesn't celebrate his kills, doesn't talk about them. Just marks them in a little notebook he keeps, like he's recording rainfall or temperature. I asked him once why he does it, and he said, 'So I remember they were real.'" The notebook was never recovered. It was lost, along with much of his personal kit, during the chaotic Allied push into Germany in the spring of 1945. What survived were the marginal notes in unit after-action reports, brief mentions of sniper fire effective at extended range, and the oral testimonies of men who had witnessed his work and struggled to articulate what made it different. But the shot that killed Oberleutnant Keller was different even by Corporal J's standards. The conditions were hostile. The target was mobile. The distance exceeded every engagement he had previously attempted by at least 300 yards. And yet, according to the sergeant who was present, Corporal J approached the shot with the same unhurried focus he applied to closer targets. He studied the wind. He watched the German officer's movement pattern for several minutes, noting the rhythm of his stride and the predictability of his path. He adjusted his scope not with mechanical precision, but with the intuition of someone who had internalized the mathematics of trajectory so deeply that calculation became reflex. When he finally fired, there was no hesitation. The rifle report was absorbed almost immediately by the wind and snow. The German officer fell, and Corporal J cycled the bolt, chambered another round, and continued scanning the ridgeline for additional targets. He did not confirm the kill verbally. He did not react with satisfaction. He simply returned to the stillness that defined him. The other soldiers in the observation post reacted with shock. Some questioned whether the shot had truly connected, or whether the officer had fallen for unrelated reasons. But when German forces ceased their open movement and the enemy line went silent, the reality became undeniable. A shot had been made that should not have succeeded, and the man who made it treated it as routine. In the weeks that followed, Corporal J continued operating in the same capacity, engaging targets at ranges that tested the limits of his equipment and his own physiology. He never spoke of the 200-yard kill. When others mentioned it, he deflected or changed the subject. To him, it seemed, the shot was not a triumph. It was simply another entry in a ledger he kept to remind himself that the distant figures in his scope were not abstractions, they were men, and he had ended them. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing where these documented accounts reach and at what moments of the day or night. After the war, Corporal J returned to civilian life with little fanfare. He did not join veteran organizations. He did not speak publicly about his service. When contacted years later by a military historian researching sniper tactics of the European theater, he declined to be interviewed. The only statement he provided, relayed through a family member, was brief. "I did what I was trained to do. The rifle worked. The war ended. That's all there is." But the rifle did not work in isolation. It worked because a man understood distance not as a measurement but as a relationship, between bullet and target, between calculation and instinct, between the mechanical and the human. The shot at 200 yards was not magic. It was the culmination of skill, patience, and a willingness to attempt what doctrine declared impossible. The war demanded results. The man delivered precision, but some shots are remembered not because they were celebrated, but because they were silent and true. A bullet fired from a Springfield M1903A4 at a target 200 yards distant does not travel in a straight line. It arcs, it drops, it drifts. The projectile, a 30-06 Springfield cartridge weighing 150 grains, leaves the muzzle at approximately 2,800 feet per second, but within the first 100 yards, atmospheric resistance begins to slow it. By the time it reaches the 200-yard mark, the bullet has shed nearly half its velocity and descended more than 30 feet below the line of sight. To compensate, the shooter must aim not at the target, but at a point in space that exists only in calculation and intuition. This is the mathematics of long-range marksmanship, a discipline where success depends on understanding forces invisible to the naked eye. Gravity pulls the bullet downward at a constant rate. Wind pushes it laterally, with deflection increasing exponentially as distance grows. Temperature affects air density, which in turn affects drag. Humidity alters the bullet's flight path in ways so subtle they are often ignored at shorter ranges but become critical beyond 800 yards. And if the target is moving, the shooter must account for lead time, the delay between trigger pull and impact during which the target continues its motion. When Corporal J fired at Oberleutnant Keller, he was solving an equation with variables he could not measure precisely. He had no ballistic computer. He had no laser rangefinder. He had no meteorological data beyond what his senses provided. The Weaver, 330C scope mounted on his rifle offered magnification, but it did not calculate windage or elevation. Those calculations existed only in his mind, shaped by experience, training, and the kind of spatial reasoning that separates competent shooters from exceptional ones. The bullet drop alone required him to aim approximately 8 to 10 feet above Keller's head, depending on the exact range and the rifle's zero setting. Most military snipers zeroed their rifles at 300 yards, meaning the scope's crosshairs aligned with the point of impact at that specific distance. Beyond that, the shooter had to hold over, aiming higher to compensate for the bullet's downward arc. At 1,200 yards, the holdover was so extreme that Keller would have been barely visible in the lower third of the scope's field of view when Corporal J placed his crosshairs on the target point in the sky above him. Wind was the greater challenge. On the day of the shot, conditions were unstable. Snow fell intermittently, and gusts swept across the open ground in patterns that shifted every few seconds. A crosswind of just 10 miles per hour at 1,200 yards could deflect a .30-06 bullet by more than 6 feet. If the wind varied along the bullet's flight path, stronger near the shooter, lighter at mid-range, shifting direction near the target, the deflection became unpredictable. Corporal J had to read the wind not just at his position, but across the entire span of terrain between him and the target, using visual cues. The way snow moved, the sway of distant vegetation, the angle of smoke, if any, was present. Then there was the matter of Keller's movement. He was not walking. He was running, moving at an estimated 6 to 8 miles per hour across the sniper's field of view. To hit a moving target, a shooter must lead it, aiming not at where the target is, but where it will be when the bullet arrives. At 1,200 yards, the bullet's flight time was approximately 2 seconds. In that time, Keller would travel between 15 and 20 feet. Corporal J had to predict not only Keller's speed, but the consistency of that speed, and place his shot in the space Keller would occupy 2 seconds in the future. Military marksmanship doctrine of the era did not train for such engagements. The maximum effective range for sniper operations was generally listed as 800 yards, with targets beyond that considered targets of opportunity rather than deliberate engagements. The probability of a first-round hit on a moving target at 1,200 yards under ideal conditions was estimated by post-war analysts at less than 5%. Under the conditions Corporal J faced wind, snow, cold, no spotter, moving target, the probability dropped to near zero, and yet the shot connected. In the decades following the war, ballistics experts and military historians attempted to reconstruct the shot using modern technology. Computer simulations, laser range finders, and ballistic modeling software were applied to the known variables: rifle type, ammunition, estimated wind speed, target speed, and range. The simulations confirmed what common sense suggested. The shot should not have succeeded. The margin for error was too narrow, the number of variables too great. Even experienced marksmen, given multiple attempts under controlled conditions, struggled to replicate the feat. One analysis conducted by a former U.S. Army marksmanship unit instructor in the 1980s concluded, "The shot, described in the historical record, represents either an extraordinary confluence of favorable conditions that negated multiple sources of error, or a level of skill and intuition that exceeds what we currently understand about human performance in high-stress marksmanship. It is not impossible, but it is improbable to the point of being unrepeatable." The rifle that Corporal J used was not recovered after the war. It was likely turned in during demobilization, refurbished and reissued or scrapped. No record exists of its serial number or specific characteristics. What remains is the shot itself, documented in fragmented reports and the testimony of men who were present. The physics do not lie. The bullet traveled 200 yards. It struck a moving target, and the target fell. But physics alone does not explain mastery. The equations describe what happened, but not how a man, cold and exhausted, with no instruments beyond a basic scope, could solve those equations in seconds and execute the solution with lethal precision. That part of the story exists in the space between calculation and instinct, where training becomes reflex and the rifle becomes an extension of the shooter's will. The war demanded impossible things. The bullet obeyed the laws of physics. But some men bent those laws just far enough to make the impossible real. The German defensive position along the ridgeline fell silent after Oberleutnant Franz Keller collapsed in the snow. Soldiers who, moments before, had moved with the confidence that distance provided safety, now pressed themselves into trenches and behind earthworks, scanning the distant American line for a threat they could not see. The psychological impact of the shot was immediate and profound. It was not the first time they had faced enemy fire, nor the first time an officer had been killed, but the manner of the kill, the distance, the precision, the invisibility of the shooter violated their understanding of what was tactable at such range. German military doctrine emphasized combined arms and coordinated movement. Officers were trained to lead from positions of calculated exposure, balancing visibility with vulnerability. At 200 yards, that calculation had always favored safety. Standard small arms fire could not reliably reach such distances. Artillery required spotting and coordination. Mortars lacked the precision for individual targeting. The ridgeline had been chosen precisely because it offered observation and command capability beyond the effective range of American infantry weapons. Keller's death shattered that assumption. Within minutes of the shot, a junior officer, Lieutenant Hans Dietrich, who had been positioned 30 yards from Keller, issued orders to cease all open movement and to restrict officer presence to covered positions only. The order was not written. It was shouted, passed from man to man along the trench line, and obeyed without question. Dietrich later described his reasoning in a post-war interview conducted for the U.S. Army Historical Division. "We had no explanation for how Keller was killed. No artillery, no mortar. Just a single shot from a distance we believed was safe. I could not risk losing another officer to something we did not understand." The psychological effect rippled beyond immediate tactical changes. German soldiers began to perceive the American line not as a distant, manageable threat, but as a source of unpredictable lethality. Rumors spread quickly through the defensive positions. Some claimed the Americans had deployed a new type of rifle, a secret weapon with extended range. Others speculated that the shot had been fired from a hidden forward position, closer than the main American line. A few soldiers, particularly those who had served on the Eastern Front and encountered Soviet snipers, recognized the shot for what it was: exceptional marksmanship executed under improbable conditions. But even they could not reconcile the distance with the accuracy. One German corporal, whose diary was recovered from a captured position weeks later, wrote, "Keller was a good officer. He did not take foolish risks. He was crossing between positions we had used all week without incident. Then he was dead. We could not see the American who fired. We could not hear where the shot came from. It is one thing to be killed by artillery you can hear coming. It is another to be killed by silence." The shot also had tactical consequences. German forces reduced their use of the ridgeline for observation, limiting exposure and relying more heavily on indirect fire and reconnaissance patrols to gather intelligence on American positions. This shift reduced their situational awareness and slowed their ability to respond to American movements. Within 2 days, American forces exploited the hesitation, advancing their forward positions by several hundred yards without significant resistance. The single shot had not broken the German line, but it had eroded the confidence that held it together. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. German command, upon learning of Keller's death, requested detailed after-action reports from the unit. Those reports, fragments of which survive in captured Wehrmacht documents, reflected confusion and frustration. One battalion commander noted, "The loss of Oberleutnant Keller is attributed to enemy sniper fire at extreme range. No counter-sniper measures are currently feasible given the distance and visibility conditions. Officers are instructed to minimize exposure and to coordinate movements during periods of reduced visibility." The term extreme range understated the reality. At 1,200 yards, the shot exceeded what German marksmanship training considered effective for individual riflemen on either side. German snipers, many of whom were highly skilled and equipped with excellent optics, typically engaged targets at ranges between 400 and 600 yards. Engagements beyond 800 yards were rare and generally discouraged due to the difficulty of achieving reliable hits. The fact that an American shooter had succeeded at 1,200 yards suggested either extraordinary luck or a level of skill that German forces had not encountered in previous engagements. Some German soldiers who witnessed the event and survived the war later expressed a grudging respect for the shooter. In interviews conducted decades later, several former Wehrmacht soldiers acknowledged the shot as a demonstration of superior marksmanship, even as they grappled with the personal loss of an officer they had served under. One veteran, speaking to a German military historian in the 1970s, said, "We knew the Americans were capable, but that shot, it was beyond capable. It was something else. We stopped moving in the open after that. Not because we were ordered to, but because we did not want to be next." The fear was rational. If one officer could be killed at 1,200 yards, any soldier moving in the open could be targeted. The psychological weight of unseen, unpredictable lethality is one of the most effective tools in modern warfare, and Corporal J's shot weaponized that fear. It did not destroy the German position. It paralyzed it. The ridgeline remained contested for another week before German forces withdrew as part of a broader defensive realignment. When American troops eventually occupied the position, they found evidence of hasty fortification, additional earthworks, covered routes between trenches, and firing positions dug deeper into the frozen ground. All of it constructed in response to a single bullet fired from a rifle that should not have been able to reach them. Oberleutnant Franz Keller was buried in a military cemetery near the Rhine. His death was recorded in official Wehrmacht casualty lists without detail, simply killed in action. The men who served under him remembered him as competent, disciplined, and cautious. They also remembered that his caution was not enough. The war demanded movement, the shot demanded stillness, and the German line learned that distance was no longer a guarantee of safety. Precision in war is often celebrated as a virtue, a demonstration of superior training and technological capability, but precision also carries a burden that crude force does not. When artillery saturates a grid square, responsibility is diffused across the battery, the forward observer, the chain of command that authorized the fire mission. When a rifle kills at 1,200 yards, responsibility rests with a single individual who saw the target, calculated the shot, and chose to pull the trigger. There is no distance between intention and result, no buffer of collective action. The shooter owns the kill completely and irrevocably. Corporal J never spoke publicly about the weight of that ownership, but those who served with him observed changes in his demeanor as the war progressed. He became quieter, more withdrawn, less willing to engage in the casual conversations that helped soldiers cope with the monotony and terror of frontline service. His notebook, in which he recorded his kills, became a private ritual, a way perhaps of ensuring that the men he killed were not abstracted into numbers or forgotten as mere tactical successes. To him, it seemed, each entry was an acknowledgement. A man lived and now he does not, and I am the reason. The chaplain assigned to his unit noticed this. In a letter written to a colleague after the war, the chaplain described Corporal J as a soldier who performed his duty with exceptional skill, but who seemed to carry each success as a weight rather than a victory. He attended services irregularly, but when he did, he sat alone and did not participate in hymns or communal prayer. I attempted to speak with him on several occasions, but he deflected with politeness and distance. I believe he was grappling with something that language could not adequately address. Other snipers faced similar struggles. The nature of their work, deliberate, solitary, precise, forced a confrontation with the humanity of the enemy that infantry combat sometimes allowed soldiers to avoid. An infantryman firing into a distant formation could tell himself he was shooting at a position, not a person. A sniper looked through a scope and saw faces, expressions, movements that revealed individuality. The act of killing became personal, even when the target was a stranger. Military psychologists in the decades following World War II studied this phenomenon extensively. They found that snipers reported higher rates of moral injury, psychological distress resulting from actions that violated personal moral codes, compared to other combat roles. The precision of their work, rather than mitigating guilt, often intensified it. There was no ambiguity, no question of whether the bullet found its mark. The sniper knew with certainty that he had ended a specific life, and that knowledge could not be rationalized away. For Corporal J, the 200-yard shot represented the apex of his technical skill, but it may also have represented the deepest point of his moral burden. The shot was not defensive. Oberleutnant Keller was not charging American positions or threatening immediate harm. He was moving between trenches, coordinating his men, performing the duties expected of an officer. Corporal J killed him not because Keller posed an imminent threat, but because the opportunity existed and the shot was tactically advantageous. The decision was rational, strategically sound, and entirely in line with his mission. But rationality does not ease conscience. One soldier who shared a foxhole with Corporal J during the final weeks of the war later recounted a brief conversation they had. It was night time. The front was quiet. They were waiting for orders to move forward. The soldier asked Corporal J how many men he had killed. Corporal J did not answer immediately. After a long silence, he said, "Enough to know that each one of them had a reason to go home. And I took that from them." The soldier did not press further. The conversation ended, but the statement revealed a dimension of Corporal J's experience that official records do not capture. He did not see his kills as abstractions or as necessary evils easily rationalized by the larger context of war. He saw them as individual losses, each one a subtraction from the world that he had authored. That perspective, while morally conscious, was psychologically corrosive. After the war, Corporal J returned to civilian life and, according to fragmented records, struggled with reintegration. He held several jobs, none of them for long. He married briefly, divorced, and lived alone for most of his remaining years. He did not seek veterans' benefits or medical care for what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. He simply withdrew, living quietly on the periphery of a society that had moved on from the war and had little interest in the inner lives of the men who fought it. When he died in the early 1980s, his obituary was brief and unremarkable. It mentioned his military service in passing, listed no survivors, and provided no details about his life. There was no mention of the 200-yard shot, no acknowledgement of the precision that had made him exceptional. He was buried in a small cemetery with a simple headstone that bore his name, rank, and the years of his service. The notebook in which he recorded his kills was never found, but the burden he carried did not disappear with him. It lives in the record, in the testimony of those who knew him, and in the broader understanding that precision in war is not simply a technical achievement. It is also a moral one, and the cost of that morality is paid not in the moment of the shot, but in the decades that follow. The war ended, the rifle was returned, but the weight of what was done with it remained, carried by the man who aimed it, until the day he could carry it no longer. The shot fired by Corporal J on that winter day in 1945 did not end with the fall of Oberleutnant Franz Keller. It entered the informal archive of military marksmanship, passed down through training schools, tactical discussions, and the quiet conversations of soldiers who understood the improbability of what had been achieved. It became a benchmark, a reference point against which other long-range engagements were measured, and a reminder that the limits of human capability in war are not fixed, but fluid, defined less by equipment than by the individuals who wield it. In the decades that followed World War II, as sniper training evolved and technology advanced, the 200-yard shot was revisited repeatedly. Instructors at military marksmanship schools used it as a case study, dissecting the variables and debating whether the success was the result of skill, luck, or some unquantifiable combination of both. The consensus, when it emerged, was cautious. The shot was possible, but not reliably replicable. It existed at the outer edge of human and mechanical capability, a convergence of ideal conditions, exceptional training, and perhaps a measure of fortune that could not be taught or guaranteed. But the legacy of the shot was not purely technical. It also shaped the psychology of long-range marksmanship. Soldiers trained as snipers learned that distance was not merely a physical measurement, but a mental barrier, and that breaching that barrier required not just skill but confidence, a willingness to attempt what doctrine suggested was beyond reach. The shot became a symbol of that willingness, a proof that the improbable could become real if the shooter believed in the mechanics and trusted his judgment. This mindset influenced the development of sniper programs in the US. Military, throughout the latter half of the 20th century, training shifted from rigid adherence to maximum effective range standards toward a more adaptive approach that encouraged snipers to engage targets based on conditions and capability rather than prescribed limits. The .200-yard shot did not rewrite doctrine, but it expanded the conceptual space within which snipers operated, suggesting that the line between effective and ineffective range was not fixed, but situational. The German perspective on the shot also contributed to its legacy. Post-war interviews with Wehrmacht veterans revealed that the event had influenced their own understanding of American marksmanship capability. Several German officers, who later served in advisory capacities during NATO's formation, cited the incident as evidence that American snipers possessed a level of training and intuition that matched or exceeded that of their German counterparts. This recognition, while grudging, reflected a shift in how marksmanship was valued within military cultures, not as an auxiliary skill, but as a strategic asset capable of influencing outcomes disproportionate to the resources invested. Franz Keller's death, though tragic for those who served under him, became in retrospect a data point in the broader study of how individual actions ripple through military engagements. The immediate tactical effect, the paralysis of the German defensive position, was temporary. The psychological effect, however, persisted. Soldiers who had witnessed the kill carried that memory through subsequent engagements, and it influenced their behavior. They moved more cautiously, they respected distance less, they adapted to a battlefield where the unseen could reach farther than maps suggested. In the 1970s, when the US military began formal analysis of sniper effectiveness across different conflicts, researchers sought to quantify the impact of long-range marksmanship on enemy morale and decision-making. They found that successful long-range kills had an outsized psychological effect relative to their tactical value. A single sniper kill at extended range could suppress enemy activity across a wide area, far beyond what the physical threat justified. The WII 200-yard shot was cited in several of these studies as an early example of this phenomenon. though the lack of detailed contemporary documentation limited the depth of analysis. Modern snipers, equipped with advanced optics, rangefinders, ballistic computers and rifles purpose-built for extreme distances, routinely engage targets at ranges that would have been unthinkable in 1945. Shots exceeding 2,000 yards have been documented and confirmed in recent conflicts, achieved with technology that removes much of the guesswork that Corporal J faced. But even among these modern practitioners, the 200-yard shot with a Springfield M1903A4 retains a mythic quality. It represents a baseline of human capability unassisted by modern tools, a demonstration that skill and judgment, when honed to exceptional levels, can overcome technological limitations. Yet the legacy of the shot is also cautionary. It reminds military planners and tacticians that while individual feats of marksmanship can influence battles, they cannot be relied upon as repeatable tactics. Corporal J's success was singular, the product of conditions and capability that aligned in a moment unlikely to recur. Doctrine must be built on what is consistently achievable, not on outliers. The shot is celebrated, but it is not taught as a standard to be met. It exists instead as an aspiration, a proof of possibility that inspires but does not obligate. The men who witnessed the shot, both American and German, carried its memory differently. For some, it was a source of pride, evidence that training and discipline could achieve the extraordinary. For others, it was a sobering reminder of war's capriciousness, where a single bullet could erase a life from a distance so great the victim never knew the shooter existed. Both perspectives are true. Both are part of the legacy. In the archives where fragments of the story are preserved, there are no photographs of Corporal J taking the shot, no film footage, no detailed technical diagram showing the trajectory and wind correction. There is only testimony, written and spoken, from men who were present and who saw something they struggled to explain. The absence of documentation does not diminish the reality of what occurred. It only makes the story more reliant on memory, and memory over time becomes both more vivid and more uncertain. The war ended, the rifle was retired, but the shot traveled further than the 200 yards it crossed that day. It traveled through time, through training manuals, through the minds of soldiers who learned its lessons, and into the mythology of a conflict where the human capacity for precision reached its limit, and then exceeded it. There is a silence that follows certain acts of war, a silence heavier than the noise that preceded it. When Oberleutnant Franz Keller fell in the snow at 200 yards, the silence was not merely the absence of gunfire. It was the collapse of certainty, the sudden realization among German soldiers that the safety they had assumed was an illusion, and among American soldiers that they had witnessed something beyond the ordinary mechanics of combat. The silence held both awe and dread, and in that moment the war revealed itself not as a contest of nations or ideologies, but as a confrontation between human capability and human mortality. Corporal J never sought recognition for the shot. He did not request a commendation or speak of it in letters home. When pressed by fellow soldiers, he deflected, offering only technical details devoid of emotion or pride. To him, the shot was a function performed, a task completed within the parameters of his training and the requirements of his mission. But the absence of celebration did not mean the absence of impact. The shot changed him, though the nature of that change remained largely invisible to those around him. He continued to serve. He continued to engage targets. But something within him had shifted, a recalibration of the relationship between duty and conscience that would follow him long after the war ended. The German soldiers who survived the engagement carried the memory differently. For them, the shot was a lesson in vulnerability, a reminder that even at distances they believed safe, death could arrive unannounced and absolute. Some adapted by becoming more cautious, limiting exposure and trusting their instincts over doctrine. Others became fatalistic, accepting that in war, survival was often a matter of chance rather than skill. A few, in the years after the war, spoke of the event with a kind of detached admiration, recognizing the shooter's ability while mourning the loss of their officer. All of them, in their own ways, were shaped by the understanding that precision in war is both a technical achievement and a form of terror. The rifle that fired the shot, the Springfield M1903A4 that Corporal J carried through the final months of the European campaign, was not preserved. It was turned in during demobilization, likely inspected, refurbished, and reissued or decommissioned. There is no plaque marking its history, no museum display noting its role in an improbable kill. It was a tool, and like all tools of war, it was discarded when its utility ended. But the bullet it fired continues to exist in the historical record, in the testimony of witnesses, and in the calculations of those who have tried to understand how such a shot could succeed. Physics explains the trajectory. Training explains the technique. Experience explains the judgment, but none of these fully capture the essence of what occurred. The shot was not merely the product of mechanical processes or learned skills. It was a moment where human intention intersected with material reality in a way that defied probability, where a man with a rifle and a scope looked across a frozen landscape, saw a target moving at the edge of what was possible, and chose to believe that the impossible could be made real. And in that belief, he succeeded. The broader war moved on. The Ardennes offensive stalled. The Rhine was crossed. Germany collapsed. The soldiers who fought in that unnamed engagement along the ridgeline dispersed into the chaos of victory and defeat, carrying their memories into peacetime. Most of them never spoke of the 200-yard shot again. It became one among countless moments of violence and loss that defined their experience, notable only to those who were present and who understood its significance. But in the decades that followed, as military historians began the slow work of reconstructing the war from fragments of memory and archival material, the shot resurfaced. It appeared in interviews with veterans, in marginal notes in unit journals, and in the technical analyses of marksmanship experts who sought to understand the outer limits of what rifles and shooters could achieve. It became a case study, a reference point, and eventually a story about a man, a rifle, and a single bullet that traveled farther than reason suggested it should. The story does not end with a clear resolution. Corporal J did not live long enough to see his shot become legend. Franz Keller's family, if they learned of the circumstances of his death, left no record of their response. The German soldiers who witnessed the event scattered across a defeated nation, and their testimonies, when they were recorded, came decades later, shaped by time and the need to make sense of experiences that defied easy explanation. The American soldiers who shared the observation post with Corporal J returned to lives that had little room for war stories, and most of them carried the memory in silence. What remains is the shot itself, preserved not in physical evidence, but in the persistence of its telling. It exists because men who were there believed it was worth remembering, because the improbability of its success demanded acknowledgement, and because it revealed something fundamental about the nature of skill under pressure. The shot was not heroic in the traditional sense. It did not save lives or turn the tide of battle. It was simply a demonstration of what one man could do when conditions aligned and training met opportunity. But demonstrations matter. They expand the boundaries of what is considered possible. They challenge assumptions. They inspire and unsettle in equal measure. The 100-200-yard shot did all of this, and in doing so, it became more than a tactical event. It became a symbol of precision's dual nature, its capacity to achieve the extraordinary and its burden on those who wield it. The war ended. The soldiers returned. The rifle was retired, but the sound of the shot, though long since absorbed by wind and snow, continues to echo in the archives, in the training schools, and in the minds of those who understand that distance is not merely a measurement, it is a test. And on that winter day in 1945, one man passed the test, and the world watched and wondered. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and unsettling cases. Thank you for following the story of Corporal J and the impossible shot that silenced a ridgeline. See you in the next video.